Welcome to our podcast, Unlock Your Potential. My name is Steve Porcaro.
And I'm Barry Rubin.
Today, we're going to talk to you about feedback. And I thought Barry and I have been talking over the last couple of weeks, and one of the things we've noticed is giving and receiving feedback is one of these skills that I don't know if we get a chance to practice or do on a regular basis. Not only do we give feedback in person, but we also do it online. So it's interesting how we were talking about what exactly is feedback when we're meeting in person. Now, many of us give feedback personally and professionally. We do it with our children, our spouses, our partners, our colleagues, customers, maybe our team members, maybe our subordinates, maybe even our manager. Some organizations, when you do some work online and they send you a customer service email, how is our service? Would love your feedback. That's also important, but I thought today would share some high-level strategies on giving feedback in person. And Barry and I are going to share some examples from our past, our sordid past, so to speak, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But more importantly, I think we're going to be talking about giving feedback in person. And again, this is based on some of our experiences and would love you to respond, share examples of feedback and comment on it. But before we start, Barry, you want to whet our appetite? Can you give us an example when feedback for you went well, or maybe when it didn't go well, but it was memorable for you?
Hmm. Um, the example that comes to mind is one where I gave feedback in person and it went sideways, didn't go the way I expected. Um, I was working in cosmetics and I had hired a new employee. And after her second day at work, where we spent the day of a combination of training and working with customers. I took her outside. I bought her a cup of coffee. We were going over what happened during the day. And I brought up that I could see that the follow-up might be a challenge for her because she was very shy and she wasn't comfortable on the phone and she didn't really have a lot of experience sending out cards or notes. So um, at one point, I told her what a great job she was doing. And unbeknownst to me, yeah, I didn't take into account that English was her second language.
Mm.
And I also did not know that she was a battered woman who got the job and came for the interview taking a bus in a borrowed suit. So all these things factored in. And what I said to her was, I'm so excited that you're here and I can't wait to work with you because you're a diamond in the rough and I'm going to polish you and make you shine because I saw so much potential and I wanted her to know that I was there to help her. But English not being her first language, the only thing that she got out of that whole sentence was the word rough and complained to someone above my pay grade that I had told her she was rough around the edges. And I got a speaking to, which completely caught me off guard because that wasn't the spirit with which I intended to deliver the message. So there's an example of giving feedback in person that didn't go so well.
Thank you for sharing, Barry. And that's a perfect example of why I think it's important. And going forward, I'm sure this was a learning moment for you.
Oh, yeah.
Like many of us, right? We think we're giving feedback properly or we're doing it the right way, but like a lot of things in life, sometimes we have to step back, readjust, fine tune, maybe try a different approach. So let's jump in and share some, again, high level, 50,000-foot view tips and strategies, best practices for giving and receiving feedback. to start off, I want to talk a little bit about what exactly are we talking about when we talk about feedback? What are the types of feedback? And I think the first type I'm going to start with, to Barry's example, is negative feedback. Now, Barry didn't start out intending to give negative feedback, but negative feedback where the language may come across less than positive. Usually, if someone's giving negative feedback, they're doing it to disrespect, belittle, or denigrate the person. And something simple, and again, I kind of chuckle to myself, thinking about maybe a grandmother or a grandfather, in my case, you can't do anything right. You don't know what you're doing. Sometimes as parents, they may say that. We may say things to people that we love, not realizing that it's negative and it's memorable, but it's still feedback. Now, Barry didn't intend for her feedback to come across negative. It started out as positive feedback, and positive feedback expresses encouragement and approval. And the whole goal and the purpose why we give feedback is we want to reinforce and continue positive behavior. We catch somebody doing something right and we want them to do more of it. For instance, hey, Barry, I enjoyed your presentation today on applying that new makeup, eyeliner, whatever. That's all I know. But ideally, we give it because somebody's doing a good job. We catch them and we want them to do it more of it. Now, the other type of feedback, and I've done a lot of this over the years working with my boys in scouting when we're out setting up tents or building a fire. It's usually designed for skill improvement when we give constructive feedback. Usually it's specific and it's concrete steps to improve performance or fine-tune a skill, something that they're trying to do. Something like tying knots, right? You have to practice 100 times to get that knot down, and you'll help people and give feedback when they're doing it. We want to modify behavior or change it. And again, it could skill development or something when it comes to improving performance. It's usually inviting, respectful, and behavior based, right? We want to include people and pull them closer to us as we're helping them. Another example comes to mind. Again, I have 3 boys, and we the boys and I would make dinner. Having the boys helping me, it was a great way to get them talking by having them help do things in the kitchen. Something as simple as making pancakes, breaking eggs, putting ingredients together. This was a great skill to help them develop. In my house, a way to a woman's heart was through her stomach. And, it was a great way to approach that. So those are the 3 different types of feedback we're going to be talking about. Barry, do you have any experience with positive and constructive feedback that went well that you'd like to share?
Sure. Well, that's fast forwarding 30 years to my career in ophthalmology. I had a direct supervisor who I considered to have been excellent at direct, all 3, negative feedback, positive feedback, and constructive feedback. We sat down for dinner after a day of work. He didn't shadow me. He didn't micromanage me. He just, from my progress reports that I was submitting and conversations that I had had with him, he thought that we should sit down and talk. And the way he asked to have the meeting was not confrontational or negative. It was just a chance to catch up. And in the course of the meeting, excuse me, I did get all 3. I got positive feedback, negative feedback, and constructive feedback. And his constructive feedback was actually very, very helpful because he had already made it clear in the course of the conversation, and I wasn't a lost cause, that I was doing a great job. And there were some things that I was doing that had room for improvement. And he pulled out a napkin and a pen and drew a triangle and put 3 C's on it, his 3 C's, and explained each one and told me which one I was doing great, which one was kind of in the middle, and which one needed improvement. And, gave me ideas of how to improve on the ones that needed improvement, and said, we'll circle back and have a conversation about this in a month or a couple of weeks. And when we had that follow-up meeting, he actually complimented me on the difference that counseling and constructive feedback has made, because I was able to internalize it, incorporate it, use it, change how I was operating, and improve the situation. So I used to say about this particular supervisor that I had died and gone to boss heaven, because it was always in the best interest of my success, which in turn would make the company successful, but it was never pejorative or condescending. We were speaking as equals, and he was helping me, and it was very, very impactful.
Excellent. That's a great example. Let's talk a little bit how he did such a good job and some of the criteria needed for giving feedback like that in a positive way. And I'm going to start with some of the keys to effective feedback. And this is a high level view. Again, your mileage may vary, but the bottom line is we have to deliver feedback well timed in a well-developed presentation mode, right? We have to go in there, have it thought out. And it sounds like with Barry's situation, her manager, hey, he adapted and he did a great job using the tools, but it was well-timed. It was a good time to do this, but it was also well-developed, his communication skills, the way he delivered it, to the point that Barry felt it was effective feedback. Another great skill to use is you want to approach this from the perspective when you give positive or constructive feedback to promote growth. It's not criticism, it's really feedback. And what happens is if you think of it as feedback as a gift, which is a great term I learned years ago in scouting, if someone's going to give you positive and constructive feedback, we want to look at it as a tool to help develop the individual, the team, the organization, right? We're using it to promote growth, to keep one on track. And that really should be the rationale when we're providing feedback. Another thing is, again, Barry, I did a great job of explaining the situation, creating a safe place. And Barry was in a comfortable setting. It sounded like she was relaxed. She was receptive to receiving that. And I think it's very important to give feedback. The person or the team, the group have to be open to receiving it. And it's your job, if you're providing feedback, to kind of help set that tone whenever possible. The other, I would say, final takeaway that I'd like to share, if we're giving feedback, it usually has to be as close to the situation, almost immediate. It has to be productive, and it has to be done in a timely manner. As much as possible, I know there are times life happens, we get pulled away, but if you're going to offer feedback to someone, try to give it to them as soon as possible so it's fresh in their memory, and also to help them do something different or better going forward. I know there are times when people say, you know what, I'm going to make a note, I'm going to follow up with Steve when I speak to him in 3 months, because that's when we're going to have our quarterly meeting. Well, waiting 3 months is not immediate, it's not productive to have me keep going in one direction when I need to be going in another. So that's in some ways the foundation, some of the big keys to giving feedback. Anything, Barry, that you would suggestions or other keys that we might have overlooked or something you would like to add?
No, I think your discussion around when is a good time to give feedback is extremely important. And the first thing I started thinking of was pets,
Mm,
because if you scold a pet 20 minutes after it pees on the carpet and you're in the living room and the dog peed on the carpet in the bedroom, it's just going to be confusing and he's
mm,
not going to understand why you're yelling at him. And if you're trying to train someone or educate them on the right way to do something, if you witness them doing it incorrectly, it's best to catch it when it's happening and point them in the right direction. And that applies to humans too, because if something that seemed like a small error to the person making it was actually a big error, but the person who witnessed it and wants to give the feedback waits too long, that can really cause a strain on the relationship, because then the person on the receiving end of the feedback is going to say, oh my God, that's so important. Why didn't you tell me sooner?
right. So, and again, remember, not everything is based on right or wrong. It's really, and this is interesting, when we talk about limitations of feedback, it could be just a better way, a quicker way, a less stressful way, not necessarily wrong or right. And when we think about limitations of feedback, sometimes we have to step back and say, what are the perception and inherent biases of the person delivering feedback? Do
Mhm.
they have a perspective that's different from yours or vice versa? So, one of the things we have to be aware of, whether we're giving or receiving feedback, it's also based on the individual that's giving it or receiving it.
And
That's
that's
that
my, I'm sorry, I was gonna, that was just my poor choice of words, because in the example in my head that I was thinking of, which I'm not going to share, it was an ineffective tactic. And to me,
right.
ineffective is wrong. So if that was so ineffective, why didn't you tell me sooner? So I apologize for the poor
No, no,
word
no. It's
choice.
not no, and that's okay. It's just again, this is funny because I had a flashback with children when we say that's wrong, don't do it that way. And then you think about it and it's like, it doesn't matter how they fold the clothes, set the table, clean their room. It's just
Mhm.
maybe as a parent or coach, maybe this is my preference. So that brings us to sometimes the limitation that we run into with feedback. It's affected by the motives of the person giving feedback, which
Mm.
may not be conscious or clear. They may not even realize it. And Barry and I have laughed and joked and talked about we're all products of our environment, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. And what our grandparents went through and our parents went through and what we went through, and whether we're passing that on to our children, our pets, our colleagues, our community, everyone has different motives, and that may impact us sometimes giving feedback, and we might not even be aware of that.
Right.
So think about that. The other big challenge, and this is kind of interesting. Now, there's a lot of overlapping challenges when it comes to feedback, communication styles being one of them, and that impacts many things. But sometimes the person, the recipient of the feedback, may not understand what the feedback, how it relates to their situation if we're not crystal clear. If we're trying to be delicate and gentle and not come at them with like a sledgehammer, we may be trying to gently lead them. So we may have to make sure that our intention, our language, specific and clear, and we want to help the individual connect the dots. And I've been on both sides of that where I basically came out and said, "You're beating around the bush. T tell me what you mean." I'm not going to get upset. I'm upset because you're kind of wasting my time and I don't understand what you're talking about. And it
Mm,
goes back to different people's experience, education, training, background, perception. Something as simple as that. Most people, when they're giving feedback, they're just as concerned with the individual who's receiving the feedback as well. So, something to consider. Also, sometimes when we give feedback, this kind of goes hand in hand. We're giving it based on our experiences versus what's happening, right? What is there only one way? Again, I think back when I worked in a restaurant, the person I worked for was like my Italian grandfather and his wife. I worked in an Italian restaurant and he taught me how to make pizza dough. And to me, that was the only way to make pizza dough until I went and took some other training and other classes and realized, there are other ways to do it. So in some ways, feedback could be distorted coming from people's own perception. So we have to realize that sometimes we struggle with that too. We're looking at it from our perspective with our blinders on. Sometimes we have to pull back and say, I can understand how, and I've been married a long time. My wife and I will look at the same thing, but see different outcomes. Same thing happens with feedback. All right, Barry, any other limitations that you may have run into that you think are relevant?
hmm. Mm, but there's not an example jumping out at me at the
Okay.
moment.
Yeah, and it's one of these things where um the funny thing is sometimes and it with young people, my wife shared a story the other day. Um I enjoyed cooking and I have experience cooking. I still cook a lot today. And when my youngest son was 3 years old, he watched my wife break an egg. And he said to her, Mom, that's not how you break an egg, because she did it with two hands. And he said, This is how you break an egg. He did it with one hand because that's the way I did it. And that's the way he was exposed. So sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And in my son's eyes, at that point, that was the only way to do it. And that does impact feedback. And we laugh about it now because my wife said, I still can't break an egg with one hand.
Me
So,
neither.
you know what? I never thought of it as a skill. It's just something I picked up and you do it because, hey, all the great chefs on TV were doing it.
Hmm.
So one of the things too, I think when we give feedback, we talk about, and we're going to dive a little bit more in depth, but when we talk about sharing feedback, it's, and my wife is a good example. She's reminded me sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it. And it's interesting when it comes to leadership, communication, collaboration, building rapport, coming out and telling somebody, hey, I've noticed you've been absent from required meetings, maybe tardy to some of the client meetings, maybe you've been late with a couple reports. That's a positive way to share that. If I flip it around and basically just said, hey, Barry, you know what? You're pretty rude, you're lazy, and inconsiderate.
Oh,
What does that mean? Which one is going to provoke a reaction and which one is going to be helpful?
right.
So the thing is, giving appropriate feedback, using the right phrases, being professional, coming from a place of, hey, Barry, I want you to be successful. I've been watching you do some presentations. I have a couple suggestions and observations I'd like to share with you. Would you be open to that? Usually, Barry's going to say, great, right? I hope.
Yeah, because you want the person to buy in to information that will help them do their job better. If you don't present it that way, in 80 to 90% of the cases, it's going to be demoralizing and have the opposite effect. So what you say how you say it is just as important as what you say. And I'm guilty of that because I'm very tough on myself. And even when I think I'm being nice, sometimes I can be tough and I don't, it comes from the right place. It just comes out in a way that's perceived by the recipient differently than I intended it.
That reminds me of the Monster Inc. movie, We Scare Because We Care. So, all right. So let's talk about blocks to accurate and effective feedback. These are some of the obstacles that we either want to go around, go through, navigate. How do we overcome some of these? Some we may be aware of, and some we may, as we develop and fine tune and practice, we may stumble into these. I think that the first one I want to talk about for a moment is feeling of discomfort, anxiety about discussing performance issues with somebody, or whether it's skill development. Um, Sitting people down and saying, Barry, I'd love to talk to you. You know, I'm your manager, I'm your coworker, or I'm a good friend of yours even, and I've noticed you've been doing something. I'd like to talk to you about it. That takes a lot of effort to bring as a someone who's sharing feedback, but also sometimes the person receiving is stressed too when they say, "Hey Barry, can we make it a meeting 2 days? I want to talk to you about your performance." That's hard, right?
Mhm,
So
mhm.
it's not sometimes for the meek and the mild to go in. And I know for a lot of emerging executives and leaders who are new to the leadership role, sometimes that can be stressful, no doubt about it. Another thing that we get concerned about sometime is, are we concerned about the response we're going to get when we share feedback with somebody, even positive feedback? Just because you're sharing positive feedback doesn't mean that's what they're hearing. Some people get very irate, upset, defensive, and again, human nature. And it comes with maturity, experience, professionalism. Everyone's at a different point. There are some 10-year-olds who take feedback great because they've haven't associated feedback with any type of negative feelings. Other people, they have, again, grandparents working in certain places, certain experiences. When someone says, Steve, I need to talk to you, the first thing is, oh my gosh, it's negative. So maybe it's unrealistic fears about conflict or confrontation. And that's something that each of us have to look at and say, what's realistic? What's unrealistic? Where do we draw that line? Another thing from a leadership role, and this, I just had a discussion with an executive in a small organization. Are we hoping the situation will resolve and the need to get involved will go away, will dissipate? Sometimes things happen, people, lives are busy. You think about the pandemic, think about cold and flu season, think about health. Things are happening. If one of my team members is temporarily less performing, less than expected, do I give them time or do I say, I'll address it now? And that's a tough one. You know your people, things happen, individuals go through it. If my wife is having a bad day because something happens at work, or she's just going through something, we all have that. But think about if you're in a role, a leadership role, or a team member, you're working with a colleague and you're mentoring, coaching, guiding them, think about what that cutoff is. As Barry said earlier, we're not giving people the benefit of the doubt if we let them continue in a direction without giving them feedback in a timely manner.
Mhm.
Another thing that happens sometimes, and this is just the reality of our workplace today, people are overwhelmed, we're busy, we could be short-staffed. Again, cold and flu season. My friends who are in the tax world, it's tax season coming up. Sometimes people are so busy, maybe they're creating this busyness, so there's never a right time to give constructive feedback to somebody. Not everyone is comfortable talking to individuals about constructive feedback. And it's understandable because, as Barry mentioned earlier, is there a perception that we're doing something wrong? It's an error, it's a mistake. Even with the best intentions, Barry said, hey, I'm going to help somebody. What is that individual going to perceive? And that's a reality. And again, use your best judgment. Um, the other thing, and again, I'm working with a client now, and this happens for many reasons, right? People are sick. Someone's traveling for business, right? If supervisors are gathering performance issues over a period of time to discuss at a annual or semi-annual performance meeting, I'm going to meet with Barry in 6 months and I want to keep a list of things to talk to her so we don't waste our time in that meeting. Barry said earlier, if it's something important, tell me now. Don't let me work for the next 5 or 6 months if I'm going off course. And again, sometimes we don't think about doing it purposely. It just kind of happens. And some of it is we are creatures of habit, tradition, and custom. Maybe that was the way you were taught to give feedback, but it's also something that when it comes to best practices, we want to minimize these blocks or hindrances to providing accurate and effective feedback.
Hmm.
Anything, Barry, that come to mind? Any?
Well, yeah, actually, in the example that I gave earlier of giving feedback, um, my sense of urgency created my need to give this person this feedback. And there were a lot of unknown factors, as I mentioned, what I found out after the fact. So uh, part of that timing is actually you're not always given the luxury of really getting to know the person you're giving the feedback to. And in that instance, knowing this woman better and maybe having learned more about her background, I would have had enough information to deliver it differently, because it was supposed to be constructive feedback, because my job was to not educate, but train. I
Mm.
educated her on the product, but I had to train her how to do the business aspect of the job. And if I had known all those things, I think I naturally would have delivered it differently, because I have a great deal of empathy, and I'm not a monster. So I think it was just in
Contrary to
that.
popular belief, right?
Exactly. So I think in that case, it just was, jumping into action without having all the facts first. And that's important. Sometimes it's not the feedback facts jumping into action. It was the human facts before jumping into action.
Right. So, Barry, this is a great segue to how do we set the stage to giving and receiving feedback so it's productive? And again, there's a fine line between um, coming on just right and coming on not enough, right? How do we balance that? So, Barry, the tone, setting that positive intention to be helpful rather than right, very important. And
Mhm.
most of us, as adults, as professionals, we want to help our teammates be successful. We want our organization to be successful. We want the individual to be successful. And there are times when people may come across and, and I've heard people mutter under their breath, oh, this person always wants to be right. They're a know-it-all or they're a smarty pants. Usually not the intention, but it's important that it's a positive intention to be helpful, not right. At least that's the goal, right? Most of us are heading that way. Also, how do we keep our calm while embracing the possibility of discomfort, right? Keeping your cool in a stressful situation. And it's stressful because to your point, Barry, if this is somebody new that you're giving feedback to, or you've never spoken to them before, yes, it could be uncomfortable. On the other hand, if it's somebody you know and you've worked with or you've known for a while, maybe they never received feedback like this. So on one hand, it's bracing for something that may or may not happen, but we still have to keep our calm because the way we react, our body, our tone, our language, our even our eyes, our expressions kind of can set things off too. And I think it's important, right? We're setting the stage. We also we want to uh, we talk about exuding trust, right? If we're building rapport, this is Barry, I want to talk to you. I want to help you. You're a valuable member of our team. I notice you're doing something. This can save you some time, some frustration, some energy. Can I share some ideas with you? Setting that tone, and as my wife used to laugh, when the kids were younger, I would make snacks for the kids, and I would make these vegetable platters or these cheese and crackers. But I'm not an artist per se, nor a makeup, or my wife is an illustrator. I have very little artistic skills, but my wife would always laugh because I would always present the food and make it look visually appealing. And the kids bought it up, right? It was all about presentation. This is the same thing we're doing when we're setting the stage for feedback. So think about, how do we set that stage? Another thing that's very interesting, we've talked a lot about communication, but having this willingness to listen, truly listen, empathetic, active listening is hard in the best of times. We have to go in there with the intent to listen, to understand, not to respond, whether we're giving or receiving feedback. It's important. And sometimes, and again, life happens. We get meetings, we're getting pulled in different directions. My alarm's going off, my dog has to go out, I got to jump on Zoom. Taking time and giving someone the gift of listening is so valuable and underrated. We also want to be flexible in our communication style. And when we talk about being flexible in communication style, Barry learned a valuable lesson talking to someone. English may be their second or third language. Maybe they don't have the same experiences. Maybe they don't have the technical background. And we do this now. If I'm talking to someone about orthopedic trauma, reconstruction, biologics, am I going to use technical terms with them? No. Think about the audience you're communicating with and saying, how can I be flexible to best communicate and adjust my communication style? Again, a lot of professionals, we do it sometimes unconsciously. Now we want to be conscious of it. Put it in the forefront of your mind.
Yep.
We want to be curious. Again, there are days I wake up thinking I know it all, and then there are days I go to bed thinking I don't know anything. But part of it is we want to listen to learn, be opening to listening to what other people are saying, because it will help you whether you're trying to sell to a new client, lead, guide, coach, mentor, give feedback. We want to be listening, whether it's getting feedback, whether we like it or not. I don't want to disregard the message because I don't appreciate or respect or like the person giving me feedback. Oh, that person's a know-it-all. And that's my boss. Now, Barry shared examples. Her boss came in, gave her great feedback. If Barry wasn't open to that, here she is all this time later, still thinking about it. And we can all share stories where we got great feedback because we were willing to listen and to realize that I don't know it all. And once you get past that point, it's amazing, right? Everything is a learning moment. A couple things too, keep your mind open, I think without judging motives. One of the things Barry and I have talked about in the past, as much as I've been with Barry for a long time professionally. We've been working together for a while. Still can't read her mind. Been married with my wife for a long time. Still can't read her mind. Sometimes we can't assume we know the motives why people are giving feedback or why they're sharing this now. Usually, it's with the best of intentions, and I want to take it like that. Most people are not malicious, they're not evil, they're not mean. In my experience, and I do a lot of work with communication and team development, there's a lot of misunderstanding. Again,
Hmm.
we're listening to respond, not to understand. And the last, I think, element of setting the stage, and it could be one of the biggest, how do we manage our own emotional response? If I'm hearing something that I don't agree with, I don't like, am I gonna get frustrated and am I gonna fume? Am I gonna, explode? If I'm sharing something, am I gonna share it with an even tone, a low tone, or am I gonna yell and bark at someone, right? Our emotional response it does set the tone, whatever side of that equation we're on. I think these are some of the fundamentals when it comes to setting the stage for giving and receiving feedback effectively.
Hmm.
Anything come to mind, Barry? Anything that I might have overlooked or missed?
Yeah, I think this is very thorough, and I'm thinking now to instances of just life where it's not necessarily work related. Um, I'm helping somebody move, and I got a text message that said, I'm going to pick up dinner. I'll be back shortly. And I had had plans to go help him move. So when he said that, I said, okay, well, then I'll be over in half an hour because I didn't want to be there if he wasn't home. And once we reconnected and I showed up, he said, well, I actually was going to leave the door unlocked and I was texting you to let you know that I was leaving in case I wasn't home. And I said, okay, I understand that now, but I apologize for creating a half-hour delay because there weren't enough words in that sentence to give me direction. If I had known that you were leaving the door unlocked and you were expecting me momentarily, I would have left. But because you told me you were leaving and going to be gone for 20 minutes, I said, I'll be back in half an hour. And he's like, you're absolutely right. I'm sorry. I just have a lot on my mind. And neither of us got upset and we just laughed at it because use your words.
Well, all right. So it is funny, and this is a perfect again. Let's talk about a few tips for offering the effective feedback because again, you can have the best intentions, but once we set the stage, how do we actually give that feedback effectively? And again, I think we can all step back and think, oh man, I could have done that better, or I did that really well. I want to do more of that. So, one of them is, and you mentioned this earlier, we want to take the time to establish that rapport before moving into feedback, right? Some people get right to right
Nuts
to
and bolts.
business.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes, hey, Barry, I want to check in. How are you doing? Is this a good time for us to meet? You may say no, and some people may say, well, it doesn't matter. I got 5 minutes. I want to give you feedback. That's not really the best time to give feedback. So we want to check in and see how people are doing before we move into the feedback stage. Because it's just as easy to say, Steve, I don't have time right now. Can we meet first thing in the morning? And I'll say, great. Boom. Then we're done. If you
Yeah,
say,
you
I
were,
have plenty of time, let's do it now. But getting right to business, as much as you want to do that, check in, take a temperature, establish that rapport, make sure this is a good time and you're ready to move forward.
yeah, I mean, we're all human. It's always, even in meetings, there is space for small talk first. Phone calls. How are you? How are you doing? What's new? What's going on? finish that, then move into the details because, excuse me,
It's
when you dive in, you're missing the human part of the equation.
all right. So think of that as feedback foreplay. We're adults. We can say that. All right. So the other part, when we're giving feedback, be specific, focus on the issues, and acknowledge what people are feeling. I think being specific is really key, and we want to focus exactly specific on the issue. When it's vague in general, that's not very helpful. Hey, Barry, you can do better in that presentation. What does that mean? So try to be specific, focus on the issue, whether it's data, whether it's presentation, whether it's, being prepared. You want to make sure you're giving feedback that can be helpful, that can be acted on. And I think that's important. We also want to give the recipient time to react and respond. If I'm saying, hey, Barry, I know you're traveling this week, but when you get back, I'd love to sit down and have a meeting, catch up with you. Well, in my mind, I'm meeting with Barry in a week, and I'm thinking about the feedback I'm giving her. If she sits down and I give her this, I show up and throw up, and I expect her to respond and to hear and do everything in 30 seconds, that's not fair. She has to digest it, and you have to give people time. Again, we come to the joke in my house, my wife and I come to the same conclusion just at different times. So give the recipient enough time to hear what you're saying, to understand it, to digest it. And if you're looking for a response, give them time to react and respond appropriately. Because if you rush right in, they're just going to spout the first thing out
Mhm.
in their mind without thinking about it. And again, it's not, sometimes you may say, think about it and come back the next day and let's discuss next steps. I mean, that's okay. I mean, we're so used to saying everything has to be done now, now, now. Sometimes it isn't. Part of this and the follow-up is make sure that if there's a desired outcome or goal that you're trying to reach, especially with the individuals, make sure it's clearly stated and understood. Again, there's an assumption that I know what I'm saying. How come you don't know what I mean? So if you're giving somebody feedback, Barry, I have some feedback on your presentation. I'd like to sit down and give you some feedback on how to deliver that presentation report in 10 minutes or give us more detail in the written report. You want to be specific so people know what you're talking about. Can't be a natural assumption. Again, you and I may look at the same thing and see different outcomes, right? Different sides of it based on our perspective.
Yep.
When we talk about setting rapport, personal stress levels are also important. Um, Everyone is dealing with stress. We have it personally and professionally. And sometimes, again, post-pandemic, winter storms, cold and flu season, sick family members, politics, world, events. There's all types of things going on. If you're giving feedback, you want to confirm that this person is at a good place, ready to receive it. Sometimes people's cups are full, and even if you have great feedback and you're going in there to help them, just may not be the time. Um, Again, I'm not talking about one-off things, but checking personal stress level. Just because I'm having a good day and I'm feeling fine and I'm ready to talk and do all this stuff doesn't mean everyone's at that same point. So save yourself a little frustration.
Mhm.
Another thing that's very helpful, and we talked about the feedback sandwich, focus on strength to increase. Barry, you're a great presenter. You have great eye contact. You engage the audience, right? How do we start off? Most people, the secret to success is to do a few things, but do them well. And if we play to our strengths, that's going to help us be more successful when we talk about unlocking your potential. Sometimes people are told, you got to work on your weaknesses, and they forget about doing the things that make them successful because some people, hey, you need to work on something. It's hard to fill in those gaps. I'll never be a 6'5" center for a NBA team. I'll never be a illustrator like my artist wife. So I'm not going to compete. The secret to success, focus on your strengths and do more of them. And when we give feedback, that's a great way to follow that path. Also, if you're giving feedback, you can ask questions to clarify as as well as the person that you're giving feedback. There's an assumption again that we're all understanding the same dynamics, the same situation. Don't be afraid to ask questions to clarify. And I would encourage, if you're giving feedback to somebody, to let them ask questions so they can fully understand the feedback that you're giving them. I think it's hard sometimes, years ago when I got hired in orthopedics trauma, one of the guys I was training with, we were laughing about, oh, do we sell screws and a screwdriver or just the screws? And it was kind of like a joke because you don't want to be the person that gets hired because of your expertise and say, oh, I don't want to ask a dumb question. And sometimes we don't make it easy for people to ask questions because, well, we think less of them. And I think it's changed over time, but sometimes there's still a little stigma attached. I don't want to ask that question, but allow people to ask questions. And the last one, I think, and this is a good follow-up, have a follow-up plan for action if you're going to give feedback. Hey, Barry, I know you have a presentation coming up in a couple weeks. Let's take some of these ideas that we discussed to include in your next presentation. I look forward to seeing that in 2 weeks. Something that's even a SMART goal, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. If you're going to create a follow-up plan and you're going to share feedback and you want someone to implement it, that's a great way to say, hey, how about I follow up with you in a few days to see how those things are coming along? Because now you're encouraging, supporting, and helping that person reach those goals. So those are the big tips. I'm sure there are other things, but I just want to focus on this core group when it comes to strategies and tips for offering effective feedback. Anything jump out at you, Barry? Do you need help in a few days with your presentation skills?
I think I'm good.
All right.
But yeah, the idea of setting a structure for follow-up and having that structure be reasonable is very important, because depending on the size or the magnitude of what needs to change, sometimes changes can't be made overnight, and you don't want to create unnecessary pressure on the person by saying, I'll follow up with you in a few days. If you're talking about, a complete overhaul of a system or, a structured process. So I think sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction on both sides, because the person giving the feedback really does want faster results than the person receiving it can deliver. And the person receiving feedback might give a knee-jerk response to try and answer something that seems to be of an immediate need, but they didn't really have that time to give it a good amount of thought and come up with the right answer. I mean, how many times have we been in a meeting and hindsight's 2020. You go home and you think, oh, I should have said this, or oh, I should have suggested that, because you felt the pressure to respond in the moment instead of feeling like you had been given the time to formulate the correct response.
I would say, Barry, that happens virtually every meeting. So,
Exactly.
all right.
Exactly.
So let's wrap this up with a few tips on receiving feedback. I think at the end of the day, and we talked about this, sometimes the person sharing feedback, it can be just as stressful as the person receiving feedback. So I
Mhm.
want to be clear that these are high level strategies and tips. You may take a couple and incorporate. There may be one thing here that may be helpful to you going forward, or you could share some of these with somebody in your sphere. But a very simple tip for receiving feedback is you want to look at this feedback as a learning moment, a learning opportunity. Um, One of the things, and I just ran in this today, I was on site with a client. It's not remedial when we're giving an evaluation or feedback. It's not to punish. It's usually to help somebody do something better, to save them time, stress, aggravation. In a business setting, it could save money. It could save man hours. It could be helpful for a client. So think about when you're receiving feedback, think of it as a learning moment. Think of it as a gift. It took me a long time to realize that it is a gift, and I want to think of it like that going forward. The next thing is we want to be open to hearing positive and constructive feedback. The negative feedback, I don't know anyone who likes negative feedback. There could be somebody out there. I don't want to say never, but for the most part, nobody wants to hear negative feedback. Some people, most people love hearing positive feedback. Hey, Steve, you did a great job here. But the constructive feedback may be misunderstood as criticism, as negative, when in fact, it may be there to help me do something different or better. So be open to hearing both of them, because getting all positive feedback is great, but is it going to help me grow professionally or personally? Probably not. This one is hard. I know in the past, when I got feedback, I would get defensive. It was a gut reaction. It was something that for many years I was defensive for many things. And that was my go-to default action. Maintaining a calm and composed demeanor took a while for me to, as I grew professionally, being able to go out there and understand that it wasn't personal. This was professional, especially hearing it from colleagues, coworkers, supervisors. In the military, I got a lot of feedback, the good, the bad, the ugly. But I want to receive feedback because that's the only way I'll get better, right? If we're looking to improve our performance and improve our outcome and increase our results, we need to get feedback. So also requesting examples, if I need more clarity, don't be afraid to say, hey, Barry, thank you for the feedback. Can you give me a couple of examples where you noticed I could do something differently? It's okay to ask clarifying questions. Again, just because I don't understand doesn't mean the feedback is not valuable. And I think people, again, sometimes I don't want to open my mouth and let people know I don't know what I'm talking about versus, boy, this person's taking the time and the energy, and I respect them and thank them for doing that. Barry, I just want to clarify, can you give me a couple of examples? And it goes a long way to helping you keep cool and calm. Another thing that's been very helpful, and I know in the past when I was in the operating room in stressful situations or camping, stressful situations, engaging in positive self-talk to help me overcome, improvise, and adapt, right? When we're in a stressful situation, we all have either a go-to theme, a quote, maybe even something that comes to mind. And I have a few sayings for me. Um, it's funny. I always talk about my goal is progress, not perfection. And everything is a learning moment. When I get stressed, I talk about I can't stop the waves, but I can learn to surf. And there are a few other things that I use about being prepared, which I learned in the Scouts, and overcoming, adapting, and improvising, which is the unofficial Marine Corps motto, right? So if I prepare to overcome, adapt, and improvise, that's setting me up to get this feedback because I want to rise to the occasion. So we all have certain things we use. Figure out what works, keep a few in your back pocket so you can pull them out, right? It's better to need them. It's better to have them and not need them than need them and not have them. So think about that. Um, when it comes to stress, I've been working on stress reduction strategies for the last, geez, at this point it's probably 20 years, but working in the OR, working with organizations and people, we're all overcome. Stress is like the common denominator. But one of the greatest things we can do to calm ourselves and balance our emotional reactions is taking deep breaths, breathing in and breathing out. And sometimes when we're receiving feedback and we're stressed, I've seen people stop breathing. They're
Mhm.
not even aware of it. There are times when people stop breathing when they're stressed, they're overwhelmed, and remembering and learning to breathe is so important. It's almost like it's a stress reliever. Think of a pressure cooker, right? Letting that breath out is letting all that stress out as well. Taking in fresh breath is cooling down my inside. So think about maintaining that emotional balance in a stressful situation. And lastly, I mentioned this earlier, if someone's taking the time to give you feedback, personally or professionally, we want to thank them for that effort. Sometimes it's hard. The people we love, the people we respect, the people we work with. It's not easy for someone to say, "Hey, Barry, can I talk to you for a minute? I'd like to share some observations." Because we don't want to damage our relationship. We don't want to damage our personal reputation. We don't want to be the person doing that. So remember, feedback's a gift. And if someone's giving us the valuable time and energy and effort, just thank them. And I think it allows me to, when I had to make that shift, realizing that it wasn't personal, people cared about me to share that feedback with me. And that's how I'm taking it going forward. So those are my tips for receiving feedback. I'm sure there are others, but this is a high level view, and I just wanted to end it there. And Barry, any tips when you've received feedback that you could share that might be good takeaways for today?
Actually, what just came to mind when you were talking about receiving it and knowing that it usually is coming from a good place, a visible example of this is any episode of Shark Tank, because
Perfect.
those people those people have spent their lives for getting ready for this moment and doing the presentation and making sure they have all the data. And sometimes the sharks can be sharks and they will come out and say, your presentation sucked, and they'll be blunt about it. Or they'll give the list of reasons why they don't think the business model makes sense. Or they'll say, I really like you as a person, but your product stinks. And how many times have we seen those entrepreneurs say, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mr. Wonderful. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. No,
Exactly.
no, I'm not going to take your deal. Thank you. And they take it with such dignity and such gratitude because they know that these people know what they're doing. And if they take that advice and incorporate it into their business plan or their product production or whatever it is, they will be more successful for it. So it's a really good example of how to receive that feedback and put it to good use and understand that it's not personal.
All right, Barry, and that's a great note to end today's podcast.
Mm.
Getting feedback from the best people there are on Shark Tank. Feedback is a gift. So
Mhm.
thank you for joining us today. And again, if you have any comments, please send them to us. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.